Welcome Life Science learners to another installment. Trust that you guys are well and excited about our lesson today. In our lesson today, we're going to continue with environmental studies. We will pay special attention to looking at the nutrient cycle. Our focus of our lesson would be on the carbon and the nitrogen cycles. We've got to recollect that we've in the past looked at other cycles such as the oxygen cycle as well as the water cycle. It's important that we understand the context of these in the biosphere and in the environment. Let's get into the overview of the lesson. Let's try and understand what are the concepts that we're going to look at and then get straight into the details of our lesson. In our lesson today, we're going to focus on firstly reviewing some important terms, and as I always mention, as you start off any lesson or as you start off your preparation on any topic, try and draw up a list of vocab and terms that are important to this section. We're going to focus on these as well as we get through the lesson. We also spend some time talking about what are nutrient cycles, and then we're going to look at some of the important atmospheric gases, especially when we come to looking at the nitrogen and the carbon cycles. We know that the atmosphere consists of gases, of which nitrogen and carbon are a significant portion of. And then we'll get straight into the carbon cycle. So let's look at some terminology that is important. We often talk about this in the context of ecology, and ecology again is the study of the relationships between plants and animals with each other and with their non-living environment in which they live. And it's important that we recognize that when we talk of the nutrient cycles, we're referring to the non-living components of the environment and how these influence the biotic factors. And hence, it's important that we have context to these cycles, looking at how the carbon cycles and the nitrogen cycles influence other organisms in that ecosystem. The next term, as I mentioned, is ecosystem. Again, this is defining a specific area in which the abiotic and the biotic components are interdependent and interact closely. It's important that we recognize that in ecology we have small areas called ecosystems, and in these ecosystems we have the biotic factors and the abiotic factors that interact with each other and are interdependent with each other, and that is what determines an ecosystem. The next concept is abiotic. Again, the concept of abiotic refers to the non-living components, and in broad we speak about factors that influence the environment such as temperature, rainfall, sunlight. We look at the quality of the soil. We also look at the physiographic factors or the lay of the land, and that was the aspect, the slope, as well as the altitude. So those are the abiotic factors. We also need to go back and look at biotic factors, and these are the living components. Again, so those are the components that produce the energy from your plants to your producers and consumers and the different trophic levels. So those are your biotic components. If we then look at the concept of biosphere, we know that it's that part of the earth where humans and other organisms are able to live and interact with each other. And a recap of the biosphere again referred to three components: the lithosphere, the atmosphere, and the hydrosphere. Finally, the focus of this lesson would be on the nutrient cycle. Again, the nutrient cycle is a repeated pathway of a particular nutrient or element, so those are the building blocks, from the environment through one or more organism and back to the environment. The concept of a cycle refers to a continuous flow of a specific substance. In our nutrient cycles, we're going to look at essential elements, which are the building blocks of complex molecules, and we're going to look at how these move through the environment from one organism to the next and are cycled in that environment. We're going to pay special emphasis to carbon cycle, which we've done in the past, but that refers to the circulation of carbon in various forms through nature. So carbon in its different forms is the carbon cycle. Nitrogen cycle, again, is the biochemical cycle by which nitrogen is converted into multiple chemical forms as it circulates among the atmosphere, terrestrial, and the marine ecosystems. So that's going to be the focus of our lesson, looking at the nitrogen cycle and how nitrogen as an element moves through both aquatic life forms as well as terrestrial life forms, as well as those organisms in the atmosphere in terms of the gases and other organisms. The oxygen cycle, we've discussed this in the past, is whereby atmospheric oxygen is converted to carbon dioxide in animals, and respiration and regeneration by green plants through a process called photosynthesis. We also know that the water cycle is an important part of the hydrological cycle, which is referring to water, which involves the continuous circulation of water on the earth and the atmosphere system. Finally, guys, it's important that we have a thorough understanding of the nutrient cycle. As I mentioned, it's the biotic components of an ecosystem that depend on the abiotic components. Here we look at nutrients being obtained from the environment and are used by living organisms to grow, reproduce, and stay healthy. So we refer to those as the essential characteristics of living organisms. And so nutrients are important for these important processes such as growth, reproduction, and general metabolism or functioning. The most important elements required by organisms are oxygen, carbon, and nitrogen. And these are known as your macronutrients. Again, macro in the context of being larger quantities. So we need these in large quantities and are important in building important biological compounds. There are other nutrients that are required in smaller quantities, and those are called trace elements. And these are those elements such as phosphorus, sulfur, iron, and other elements that are really required in micro quantities, and hence we say these are essential but in very small quantities. And these are important elements that are needed for the production of your organic compounds. And organic compounds, we refer to those that are produced through a biological process, and examples of those are carbohydrates, lipids or fats, your proteins, and other important biological compounds. It's important that we understand that the nutrient cycles ensure that nutrients are available for use and reuse over and over again. And the context of a cycle means that these are recycled in the environment continuously. It's important that we look at the atmospheric gases, and we know that the atmosphere is made up of a whole host of different gases. And we know that even though carbon dioxide makes up only 0.4% of the atmosphere, it is an important gas needed for photosynthesis. On the other hand, nitrogen is a large component of the atmosphere, 78%, and it is important for all organisms because it is necessary for making important biological compounds such as proteins and nucleic acids. As I mentioned, nitrogen is forming a significant proportion that we look at. With carbon dioxide, again, although in a very small percentage in the atmosphere, is still a significant element in nature. In our lesson, we're going to focus on the carbon as we move forward. Carbon is a basic building block of all organic materials and therefore of living organisms. Most of the carbon on Earth can be found in the crust, with some in the oceans and most available in the atmosphere. Carbon can move from one reservoir, essentially in the environment, to another by the following processes. And we'll overview these processes. A process called combustion, photosynthesis, metabolism, cellular respiration, precipitation, and the process of decomposition or decaying. This is an overview of the carbon cycle. We've looked at the main processes, guys. It's time that we go for a break. When we come back, we will look at these processes in detail and get a better understanding of how carbon is cycled in the environment and is an important component of all living organisms. So have a little stretch break, get some oxygen into the muscles, and get ready for the next bit of the lesson. Short break and I'll see you now. Welcome back, guys, from the ad break. Trust that you're feeling a bit relaxed. Let's look at the lesson and go further into the carbon cycle. As I mentioned, there are various processes which we will unpack now. Let's look at these processes in detail. So as I mentioned, the processes that we need to look at are combustion, photosynthesis, metabolism, cellular respiration, the concept of precipitation, and how decaying and decomposition contribute to the carbon cycle. As we look at this illustration, it shows you the different process of combustion, where industries use a lot of carbon and carbon fuels and produce a lot of emissions. We're looking at plants undergoing a process of respiration, animals as well producing carbon dioxide through respiration. We're going to look at each of these processes in detail in the next few slides. So let's look at the process of combustion. Again, the word combustion refers to, again, the use of oxygen to break down certain substances. Let's refer to that in the environment. So the burning of wood, fossil fuels by factories, and auto emissions, so the emissions from automotive industries or vehicles, they release carbon, which is an organic matter, into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. So when you look up here into this map, you will see a large factor that contributes to the presence of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is the release of carbon dioxide from fossil fuels. Fossil fuels, which include coal, oil, these are organic compounds that are rich in carbon. During the process of combustion, the process releases the carbon dioxide. In that process, we benefit from the energy that is produced. However, the carbon dioxide then moves back into the atmosphere. Even during a veld fire, when we see the veld burning or we see bushes burning, that again produces a large amount of carbon dioxide by that process of combustion. So again, fire, burning of wood, coal, etc. produces large amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. The next concept is photosynthesis. Let's try and understand what photosynthesis is. So carbon dioxide is taken up by plants during a process of photosynthesis and is converted into energy-rich molecules such as glucose, which contains carbon. We know that, again, plants have the ability to be able to use atmospheric carbon dioxide. By a process called photosynthesis, they convert the carbon dioxide into complex molecules called glucose, which again is a carbon compound, C6H12O6, and that's glucose. And so glucose again takes the carbon from the atmosphere using the energy from the light along with water and produce these organic compounds called carbohydrates. So we see that photosynthesis plays an important role in taking the carbon dioxide and converting that into carbohydrates such as glucose. The next concept is metabolism. So in the process of metabolism, again, to unpack the word metabolism, it refers to all the chemical reactions and physiological reactions. So the reactions that happen in an organism, the building up reactions, the breaking down reactions, those that are involved in digestion, production of energy, are all called metabolism. So those reactions in living organisms use oxygen and produce carbon dioxide. So autotrophs, which are plants, convert carbon into organic molecules like fats, carbohydrates, and proteins, which animals can use. So we know that during an important process like metabolism, of which photosynthesis is one example, we can use the carbon in organic molecules as energy source for other animals. The next concept is cellular respiration, also a type of metabolism. And if we look at that, both plants as well as animals have the ability to respire. The concept of cellular respiration again goes back to where it happens in the cell. The mitochondria, which is the powerhouse in the cell, uses the carbon in the form of glucose and it breaks that down to produce energy. And in that process of breaking carbohydrates down, releases carbon dioxide as a waste product. So again, by the process of cellular respiration, where oxygen is used to produce energy, carbon dioxide is released as a waste product. So we see that these processes, both in plants as well as in animals, produce carbon dioxide and release that back into the atmosphere. So let's look at this. So animals eat plants for food, taking in the organic compounds, which are the carbohydrates. Plants and animals break down these organic molecules during a process called cellular respiration, and they release the energy and water and carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. As I mentioned, carbon dioxide is returned back into the atmosphere during gaseous exchange, and that again cycles the carbon back into the atmosphere. So again, the process of cellular respiration uses the carbon from the glucose molecule, and when carbon dioxide is released, that again returns the carbon. So again, we're looking at glucose being produced from these plants, being used by animals and plants for cellular respiration again. So that cycle ensures that the carbon which is captured by the plants during photosynthesis is released as carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere by processes known as cellular respiration. The concept of precipitate again comes from the word precipitation. Again, we looked at precipitation in the water cycle, which is the settling of water back onto the earth through rain, storm, and hail. Along with that, remember that during precipitation, lots of the water that enters the ocean and the rivers contain carbonate ions. So what are carbonates? Let's look at that. So carbon dioxide in the atmosphere can also precipitate as carbonate in the ocean's sediments. This essentially refers to how carbon dioxide dissolves with water and is available to plants, both your aquatic plants, for the process of photosynthesis. And so that is then recycling the carbon dioxide in the aquatic environment back into plants for a process of photosynthesis. The process of decomposition or decay. So this essentially refers to the breakdown of dead organisms for the release of energy. And thus, when they use the dead organisms and produce energy for themselves, they release carbon dioxide gas into the atmosphere. So during the process of decomposition, where our decomposers such as bacteria and fungi undergo what we refer to as cellular respiration, they break down the organic compounds and they release the carbon dioxide using the organic compounds, and that is what also contributes to the presence of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Photosynthesis and cellular respiration are the main carbon cycling processes involved in living organisms. If we take these two processes, photosynthesis as well as cellular respiration, both these can be interlinked to as important cycles in recycling carbon in the atmosphere. What is the importance of the carbon cycle? The carbon cycle is important in ecosystems because it moves carbon, which is an element, a life-sustaining element, from the atmosphere and oceans into organisms and back again into the atmosphere and oceans. So again, guys, if we talk about organic compounds, these organic compounds contain carbon. Carbon, again, is an important component of proteins, amino acids, DNA, RNA, and these are essential for every living organism. So the processes, both photosynthesis and cellular respiration, are crucial to recycling the carbon into organisms, living organisms, and back into the atmosphere. If the delicate balance between these two is upset, so essentially photosynthesis and cellular respiration are upset, there would be serious consequences such as global warming and climate disruption may result. What is important is that cellular respiration and photosynthesis are interlinked, and these both processes play a crucial role in maintaining the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. What happens if this balance in the nutrient cycle is shifted? What we would experience would be climate change. Climate change again refers to the changes in the environment due to human activity. We do know that some of climate change is a natural phenomenon in the history of Earth. However, there's a lot of human activity that affects the climate that can in turn affect various cycles, and one of which is the carbon cycle. So climate change and global warming are caused by a change in the carbon cycle caused by humans. The biggest cause of global warming is an increase in greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So what we have in the atmosphere are greenhouse gases. Those are the natural gases that are present. However, due to human activity, we see there's an increase in the amount of greenhouse gases, of which carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, methane, some of the other gases are a significant portion of. And these seem to contribute to an increased temperature on the surface of Earth. Let's try and unpack that. So we find that the greenhouse gases, one of which is carbon dioxide, traps the heat of the Earth, and that causes less heat from being radiated into space. And I want to illustrate that in a diagram coming up shortly. So when we look at this image here we're seeing this is the layer of atmosphere or gases that surrounds the Earth. This is made up of carbon and other greenhouse gases. During the normal process of the greenhouse effect, light from the sun bounces off the Earth and is reflected back onto the surface of the Earth by this little layer of atmosphere. It's important that this happens because this is what maintains the temperature on the surface of the Earth. If we were to remove this layer, we will find that the Earth will rapidly cool down because it is this reflected or radiated sunlight back onto the Earth that keeps the temperature stable within the normal range on the surface of the Earth, no matter where we are. However, if we due to human activity, such as increased carbon dioxide emissions, thicken that layer, we're going to find that there is the amount of light or sunlight that is radiated off the surface of the Earth decreases because we're going to find that more of it is reflected back onto the surface. And this would mean that there's now more heat from the sun warming the Earth. And this is what has contributed to significant global warming and the melting of the ice caps and increased sea levels, as well as drastic temperature changes or climate changes on Earth. So again, as I mentioned, the greenhouse effect is a natural phenomenon in which the gases on the Earth are trapped. And this infrared radiation keeps the temperature moderate compared to the other planets in the solar system. And that is significant in terms of us maintaining the constant temperature on Earth within that range that we have. However, as I mentioned, it is this effect of the increased gases that prevents the heat from escaping, and that is contributing to an increased temperature on the surface of the Earth. So as I mentioned, global warming again is exacerbated or increased by the fact that humans produce a large amount of carbon dioxide or greenhouse gases that now trap the heat and prevent that from being lost. The possible solutions is for us to be able to reduce our use of fossil fuels. Other ways would be to ensure that we plant sufficient, we avoid deforestation. These are important in maintaining the balance in the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere. Let's look at this concept again as we wrap it up. Again, worldwide industry countries need to reduce their release of greenhouse gases. And if we, as several countries, can reduce these gases, we could in turn reduce the impact that global warming has on the surface of Earth's temperature. So let's look at the nutrient cycle. Again, the concept that nutrients are obtained from the environment are important because these are used by living organisms to grow, reproduce, and stay healthy. Again, we need these nutrients. Carbon, oxygen, nitrogen are crucial. So the most important of these, as I mentioned, are oxygen, carbon, and nitrogen. These are known as your macronutrients and are needed in your larger quantities. Again, when we refer to macro, we refer to the concept of nutrients required in larger quantities. Think of carbohydrates, we need carbon. We need oxygen, we need hydrogen. Think of your proteins, we need carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, and your hydrogen. So these essential elements, which are called macronutrients, are crucial for most of our nutrients, such as your carbohydrates, proteins, and your lipids. So again, it's important we understand when we look at the nitrogen cycle, look at how large a component of the atmosphere is made up of nitrogen. A whopping 78% of the atmosphere is nitrogen, a significant component. One would question, well, how do we survive with so much of nitrogen in the atmosphere? Well, we need oxygen, and oxygen is 21%. And that's a significant component that we need during our process of inhalation. However, this nitrogen is crucial not just for our existence, but for the existence of other life forms. Let's look at how this happens. So nitrogen makes up, as I mentioned, 78% of the atmosphere. Nitrogen is important to living organisms because it is needed for the production of amino acids, which are the building blocks of proteins, as well as the production of nucleic acids. And in nucleic acids, we're going to refer to DNA and RNA. And DNA and RNA are basically the nucleic acids found in the nucleus. DNA and RNA have building blocks called nucleotides. And these nucleotides are made up of nitrogen-containing compounds. So again, a very important component that is required for genetic information to be passed from one generation to the next. Most organisms cannot use the nitrogen gas present in the air. They can only absorb it as a compound joined together with other elements. Again, humans require lots of nitrogen, and we don't get this by inhaling that nitrogen. We've got to be able to access that from the proteins we consume. So where do our proteins come from? They come from plants, they come from animals. So let's look at how that happens as well. So only a few single-cell organisms like bacteria can actually use the nitrogen directly from the atmosphere. Plants usually absorb the nitrogen in the form of nitrates from the soil. It's important that we realize that a large amount of energy is used to change nitrogen gas into soluble nitrates. So soluble nitrates in the form that is now able to be absorbed by plants. So a large amount of energy is required for that. To do this, there are three main processes: lightning, a natural process; fixation by legumes, which are plants, and I'll refer to these in a little while, as well as some industrial processes that use artificial nitrogen. Guys, lightning is a key component or a natural phenomenon. When lightning strikes, it releases sufficient energy, in fact, a large amount of energy, that causes the nitrogen gas to fuse with the oxygen in the atmosphere, and that forms nitrates. So you will see this image shows you large amounts of lightning, and the energy from these lightning bolts are able to trap the nitrogen in the atmosphere and the oxygen into compounds called nitrates, and that is what is now able to be accessed by plants. We also have plants that are called leguminous plants, and examples of these are your bean plants, your soya plants, lots of your lentils, and these plants have what we call root nodules. So these little swellings in their roots contain bacteria, and these bacteria are called nitrogen fixing bacteria. And so these root bacteria or nodules are able to use the nitrates or atmospheric nitrogen and convert that into protein and convert that into nitrates, which the plant is able to use for protein synthesis. In turn, the plants produce carbohydrates that these bacteria can benefit from. So that association is present, and that is a significant factor in terms of making nitrogen available to the plants. So as I mentioned, plants such as peas, beans, and soya are significant in being able to assist in the fixation of nitrogen. So these have special type of nitrogen fixing bacteria, which we will look at, which live symbiotically. So they live together with the plant, and they're able to trap atmospheric nitrogen and for the plants to use. And I mentioned that these nitrates are used by the legumes, and then the bacteria are provided with carbohydrates that the plants produce, and that is how that association occurs. We also know that there are industrial processes, and these industrial processes involve where artificial fertilizers containing nitrogen compounds are manufactured in industrial processes. These are quite expensive processes, but they are one way that contributes to the nitrogen being produced and kind of captured into fertilizers, which plants then are able to utilize. Here's an overview of the nitrogen cycle. If we look at it, it contains various stages of how atmospheric nitrogen is used by plants, and that energy then is available by consumers such as animals, which then makes access to the nitrogen in their body. Guys, it's important that we understand the context of nitrogen cycle following these several processes. Lightning is a significant process in fixing atmospheric nitrogen. We also saw that there's the absorption that occurs by the nitrogen fixing bacteria in the roots. We then see that animals consume and ingest that nitrogen, and that process of consuming your plant material is called ingestion. We know that all our consumers that consume these, which would be the animals, at some point undergo a process of decomposition, or when they die, and that process also releases nitrogen. Some chemical process such as ammonification, nitrification, and denitrification are important processes in cycling the nitrogen from one level to the next. We also know that there's nitrogen fixation that occurs through these bacteria. Guys, as we wrap this segment up, it's important that we look at the nitrogen cycle in greater detail when we get back. You guys have been a good audience. Have a little break, get back, and we'll get into the details of the nitrogen cycle. See you in a bit. Welcome back, life science learners, to this segment. In our segment, we're going to continue with the nitrogen cycle. It's important that we have an understanding of how nitrogen is cycled in the environment. As I mentioned, nitrogen is a very important element in the building blocks of many organic compounds. One crucial compound is proteins. We also know that DNA and RNA are important organic compounds that are essential for organisms to be able to survive and pass on genetic information. Let's look at the various processes involved in the nitrogen cycle. We also want to unpack what is the human impact. Let me go back to that. What is the human impact on the nitrogen cycle? And so that's important for us to be able to recognize, and what is the influence that that could have on the atmosphere and other living organisms. And so there are various things that humans carry out in terms of activities that influence the nitrogen cycle and upset that balance. It's important that we recognize that the balance of nutrients in the environment need to be maintained naturally, importantly, because these are crucial to the existence of all life forms. So let's get straight into the nitrogen cycle, and let's try and unpack the various different processes in it. As I mentioned, the nitrogen cycle, the crucial fixation process is called lightning. And lightning, again, has the ability to be able to take nitrogen gas and change that into nitrates when the energy from the lightning is able to fuse the nitrogen and the oxygen in the atmosphere together to form nitrates. Again, that is being able to fix the nitrogen gas into nitrates using lightning. And we see that being a significant amount of energy available to do this. The next process is the absorption of these nitrates. So ammonia and nitrates are absorbed by plants through their roots. As I mentioned earlier on, we have bacteria called nitrogen fixing bacteria. And these bacteria, as you look at these images here, are able to take in and absorb the atmospheric nitrogen and convert that into nitrates and ammonia, which is then available to the plants for processes that they need, such as protein synthesis. So we know that that's an important process of being able to absorb the nitrates and the ammonia. The next process is ingestion. Ingestion is basically the process of digestion where consumers such as animals, humans, and herbivores consume the plants, and in that process take in the proteins. We also know that other consumers, such as your secondary consumers, eat other herbivores or other secondary consumers, and in turn access the proteins. Whilst they consume the proteins, they are ingesting the amino acids in there, which contain the nitrogen. So again, we're seeing how ingestion, which is by humans and animals, they get their nitrogen and from the protein they eat. So guys, proteins, as I mentioned, are made up of amino acids. Amino acids, again, are your nitrogen-containing compounds. And these, again, form a crucial part of the building block of any organism as they develop muscle. As I mentioned, the decomposition, the process of decomposition relies on bacteria and fungi breaking down the proteins and amino acids from dead plants and animals. Decomposition is a significant process where the process of respiration occurs either with oxygen or without oxygen, and we refer to those as aerobic and anaerobic respiration. During these processes, the decomposers such as some bacteria and fungi utilize the remains of the organic material and return that back into the soil, and we see that these return the ammonium ions back into the soil. And that again is available to plants that use that for the process of growth and protein synthesis. The next process we're looking at is ammonification. Again, the broken down amino acids that are released during the process of decomposition is converted into ammonia by your decomposers. This image shows you the process of ammonification, where plants and animals that decompose during the process of their cycles of life. The bacteria in these, as I mentioned, the anaerobic and the aerobic bacteria utilize either oxygen or in the absence of oxygen, and they convert that during a process called ammonification into ammonium. And this ammonium NH4+ is again available by nitrifying bacteria, which use these in the next process. So let's look at the word ammonification. Ammonia is also produced from amino acids when broken down by decomposers. So during the process of decomposition, the ammonia is broken and released from the breakdown of amino acids. Again, that is then available, as I mentioned, to your nitrifying bacteria. Nitrification, again, the next process, certain bacteria convert the ammonia into nitrates. This process of converting into nitrates is called nitrification, converting into nitrates. These are called nitrifying bacteria. As I mentioned earlier on, we've got these leguminous plants that basically have these nitrogen fixing bacteria in their root nodules, and these are able to absorb and convert that into nitrates. Okay, so denitrification is the opposite of nitrification. So there are other bacteria that convert the ammonia and nitrates into nitrogen and nitrous oxide, which is then released into the atmosphere. These are called the denitrifying bacteria. So as I mentioned, the nitrites and the nitrates are then broken down using bacteria, which are called your denitrifying bacteria, and these in turn release the nitrogen gas into the atmosphere, again cycling that back into the atmosphere. We see that again here, we're seeing the nitrifying bacteria as well as the denitrifying bacteria helping the nitrates and releasing them back into the atmosphere. So nitrogen fixation, again we mentioned these plants earlier on. Here we're looking at your leguminous plants. These are plants, as I mentioned, beans, bean plants and soya plants. They contain these nitrogen fixing bacteria which contain root nodules in which the bacteria live. These bacteria convert the nitrogen gas into nitrates. Again, that process can be illustrated here where we talk of atmospheric nitrogen being used by these root fixing bacteria and converting that into ammonia, which is then released and used by the plant as needed. So you can see here ammonium is used by the plants, and this ammonium is available for the process of protein synthesis. As I mentioned, here's the root of a leguminous plant. Again, these swellings are called root nodules, and within these root nodules you will find there are bacteria present. And these bacteria are able to, as I mentioned, take in the nitrogen from the atmosphere as a gas, and they're able to fix that, and that nitrogen is available. This association we refer to as a symbiotic relationship, because the plants benefit from housing these bacteria in the root nodules. The plant benefits from being able to use the ammonium ions and the nitrates fixed by these plants. The plants in turn make available carbohydrates which they produce by photosynthesis. So the sugar that is produced is then needed by the bacteria, and together that association ensures that the plant and the bacteria both benefit from that relationship. So if we look at the nitrogen cycle, we can see a series of events where we've got the nitrogen gas being fixed by your bacteria, we're seeing that the nitrogen, again, being released back into the environment by decomposers, which carry out a process of decomposition. We also looked at the nitrogen fixing soil bacteria, which take the nitrates and they produce ammonium. We also looked at the comparison between the nitrifying bacteria and your denitrifying bacteria, which again assist in releasing the atmospheric nitrogen into the atmosphere. It's important that we understand what is the human impact on the nitrogen cycle. As I mentioned, due to human activity, we have significantly influenced the balance of gases in the atmosphere. One such gas is carbon dioxide, which has led to global warming. Another is nitrogen. Let's see how nitrogen in excess can affect the environment. So the process called eutrophication occurs when excess nitrates enter aquatic ecosystems. We find that the nutrients come from sewage and fertilizer runoff from farms. So we know that during the process of agriculture, farmers tend to use artificial fertilizers which are rich in nitrogen. And that nitrogen is then going to run off when it rains or during irrigation into water bodies. And so you'll find that the nitrates and containing rich nutrients pass onto the water bodies surrounding these farms or these land masses where agriculture takes place. In the water, it's going to affect the quality of the water. We also recognize that sewage contains high amounts of nitrates, and these then enter water bodies. So here's an image that's showing you industrial runoff of sewage, which could be both animal or human, which ends up in water bodies. Over a period of time, this leads to a process called algal bloom. So again, algae are a type of photosynthetic plants that live in water that are able to use the nitrogen and carry out an accelerated rate of photosynthesis. This means that they now produce large amounts of oxygen, which is able to support life forms. However, we do know that what this means is that it produces a significant layer of algae over the surface of the water, something that you would have experienced when you've been to a dam or to a river alongside an industrial area or a farm. During that period, we see an excessive algal growth. And that algal growth, again, creates what we called a curtain over the water, where the water becomes turbid, in the sense blocking out the light from reaching further into the bottom of that water body. And this in turn means that the seaweed at the bottom does not get enough oxygen. So it cannot carry out an important process of respiration. Yes, photosynthesis might occur. Very unlikely because not enough sunlight, which then means that also these plants will die. If these are important in producing oxygen for other aquatic organisms, it means that now we're going to find that your other saprotrophs cannot survive. And so the other aquatic organisms start to die. And this leads to less dissolved oxygen in the bottom of the water, and in turn affects other aquatic organisms. So here's an image of an algal bloom, and this is again where the surface of this water body is covered with an elaborate blanket of algae. Again, below this, the ability of light to penetrate through is limited. And this in turn is going to affect the quality of organisms living in there. So eutrophication again is an increase in the nutrient supply within the waterways, which will result in severe ecological consequences, one of which is a rapid growth of algal population, which we refer to as algal blooms, which in turn results in an increased availability of nutrients. As the algae die, they will decompose, and this decomposition leads to larger quantities of dissolved oxygen, which then is leading to deoxygenation of the water supply. This in turn causes the death of fish and other aquatic organisms. It's important that we understand that this balance in nature is important to be maintained. So when the nutrient cycles do not function correctly, it leads to a negative consequence, which in turn can affect the climate and many organisms drastically. The climate is changing worldwide and the earth is becoming warmer. We've discussed that when we looked at the carbon cycle. The biggest cause of global worldwide warming is an increase in greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Guys, it's important that we recognize that human impact has a significant effect on the various cycles. As we've looked at the carbon cycle and the nitrogen cycle, it's important that we understand that these are natural processes and we need to strive to be able to maintain a balance of these. Simple things like reducing deforestation or reducing the use of artificial fertilizers can help contribute to maintaining the carbon cycle and the nitrogen cycle in balance. You guys have been a fantastic audience. I trust that you've enjoyed the lesson and have engaged with the topic. I wish you well. Hope to see you soon. Have a baie lekker day. Cheers.